Clapper board, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled The War of Silent Stars. Frozen alien dragons plead with a human veteran for shelter. What happens next shocks him. Sci-fi. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. Snow fell like sifted ash over the dead valley of Borealis 9, and the wind sang a thin knife song across the ribs of the derelict refinery. Floodlights still worked out here, old human lights with chipped housings, sun-bleached warning stencils, and warm tungsten hearts that painted the snowfields a bruised amber. Sergeant Elias Rain stood beneath those lights with his hands in his coat and the collar pulled high against the cold, and he listened. He always listened. And tonight there was something in the sky behind the wind. A low tremor, not thunder, not ore haulers, not the crackle of storm-charged ice. This was different. It was as if a drum had been struck in the vacuum above his head, and the sound bled through the bones of the world. He lifted his eyes and saw trailing arcs carving black scars across the aurora. The arcs burned silently, as if someone had muted the universe where they fell. Elias narrowed his eyes and stepped onto the cleared landing grid. The grid had been his work for months, just in case someone needed help on this forsaken moon. A storm-blown freighter, a surveyor out of fuel, a miner with a bad burn. He'd been a soldier once, then a rescuer, then a man who didn't fit anywhere except under a sky that didn't expect him to talk. 3 arcs. Then a 4th, late and limping, its plasma wake stuttering like a failing heart. They fell beyond the ridge. The silent drumbeat faded. The wind returned. The world exhaled. Elias drew a breath and tasted old iron and ozone, and the memory of fires on worlds that no longer existed the way he'd known them. He slung the coil gun over his shoulder, thumbed the beacon light on his wrist to safe harbor, and started walking toward the ridge. He went alone because there was no one else left. The Borealis crew had been evacuated years ago when the ore veins turned sour and the storms grew meaner. He'd stayed. A veteran does that sometimes. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't have to. The station had been quiet enough to understand. He crossed the ridge and saw the impact craters steaming like open mouths. 4 bodies lay at the center, encased in glassy ice formed by heat against cold that didn't forgive. Snow swirled around them. They were huge, dark shapes with wings folded around themselves like cloaks, their edges a geometry he recognized from briefings in another life, from hell-sky engagements under radio silence, from ships that had died without a sound. Dragons, not the myth kind. The kind from New Pergamum dorsal arm, the kind that rode vacuum like it was sea, the kind humans had fought and then learned to fear in the war of silent stars, when an enemy neither species understood turned all communications to null and left ships blind and dumb in the dark. They were called Vian in the intelligence packets, cold blood warm chained, exothermically adaptive, skin like diamond chitin. Eyes always private like they felt too much to keep open, frozen. Elias stopped at the edge of the nearest crater and forced his boots through slush that had solidified into a brittle shell. A breath fogged his faceplate. His heart changed rhythm without asking permission. He knew what his notes would say if anyone else existed to read them. 4 Vian, crippled, asking nothing. But there was a scratch-etched circle carved into the icy ground around the nearest body. A circle with a human letter in the center. He stared. The letter was H. Not exactly, but close enough, formed by claws dragged across ice. There were newer scratches in that circle now, still fresh, still wet. Words, help, and below it, a symbol he had seen once on a tactical map when the briefing had been taken from the table and whispered instead. The sign the Vian made when their brood sought safe territory. Shelter. Elias knelt with the slow care of a man whose back had a few bad memories in it and pressed a gloved palm to the dragon's shoulder. The ice there crackled. He thought he felt movement beneath it. He listened again, not with ears this time, but with the animal brain that recognizes a heartbeat when it lies against your skin. Then a tremor. Then the faintest tapping, not from the dragon's chest, from the egg-shaped lattice of ice that clung to its belly. He leaned closer. The lattice was crystallized hydrocarbon, fancy ice, hard as sin. Within it a shape, small, curled, he knew before he knew. Brood. There were eggs on the other bodies too. He could see them now, ovals held in by binding cords that looked like braided ribbon, each with a halo of frost that pulsed in time with the tapping. A soundless metronome, a plea, he whispered without intending to. "You're not dead." The ice around the nearest creature's eye fissured, and a pupil like a long-cut gem slid into view. It fixed him. A thought he could not explain moved through him as if his bones were wires, not words, not exactly, but the direction words face when you carve them into the world. Shelter. He had the ridge at his back and the wind in his teeth and a coil gun over his shoulder, and whatever he had been before this moment didn't matter anymore. "Okay," he said. "Come on then." He stood and lifted the emergency flare gun and fired it straight up from the edge of the crater. The flare bloomed orange and sang a hot hiss into the blue-green night. He'd built an emergency sledge for air canisters and wounded miners. It wouldn't hold any of these creatures, but he could rig plows and lines and heated tarps. He could drag them. He could try. He worked with his jaw clenched and his breath short to conserve heat. He anchored winches and cranked them by hand, and he used old reactor plates as sled runners and coated them with oil that smelled like copper. He brought heated pads from the station and tucked them under the eggs where he could. He whispered apologies to eyes that watched him do it and did not understand the words but understood the hands. He got them moving an inch at a time, with the wind helping sometimes like a companion he'd forgotten. It took him long enough to grow a second beard and curse every saint he'd never believed in. But he got the first dragon onto the improvised sled. He tried to convince himself that the second would be easier. He lied. He kept going. By the time he lashed the last of the four to the last of the plates and looked up, the sky had gone from curtain to slate. The aurora had died like someone had pulled the plug on the far-off lights. The air felt brittle like glass before it shatters. Something else was listening now. He didn't have to be told. Body memory told him. The cold told him. He hauled the dragons beneath the floodlights of Borealis Station and sealed the big bay doors behind them with a thud that felt like an oath. The station heaters kicked on with the tortured wail of fans that had not been asked to be heroic. The air stank of hot dust and old oil. He collapsed for a second, then he stood and started dragging heat lamps down from ceiling racks and wiring them into circuits that had rusted quietly for a decade. When he was done, the dock looked like a cathedral of light. The dragons steamed in their ice. The eggs warmed. Frost melted in long tiers down the ridges of folded wings. The air filled with a smell like rain on metal and pepper and something else that made Elias think of engines and thunderstorms and lullabies. He unlatched his faceplate and let the heat hit his skin. The sudden sweat felt like guilt. The nearest dragon's eye opened wider and focused. The vertical pupil narrowed just slightly. Chest rose. A crack ran down the ice that held its wing to its side, and a whisper like sand sliding over stone escaped the split. It tried to speak in the air. Its voice didn't fit here. Elias pressed his palm to its shoulder again because it seemed right. He leaned in until his forehead touched the ice. Then that direction of words moved through him again, this time like a warm wind. Shelter, thank you, sorrow. Images traveled with the direction, not pictures. Rhythms. Empty skies, a field of stars dimming from white to gray to nothing, a ring around a sun, the slow, careful folding of wings around a small life that cannot help itself. Elias breathed out like a prayer. He said, "You're safe," and he did not ask himself if that was true. He worked all night and into the morning. He cut away ice where it made movement impossible, and he avoided the veins of shimmering crystal that seemed to pulse with deeper purpose. He brought water and siphoned it through little warmed filters to catch any fragments that looked deliberate. He'd learned to recognize art made by the universe. This was that. He saved each fragment in bowls and set them near the eggs. He ate a protein bar and drank black coffee that could strip paint, and he listened to the heating fans. Then a new sound, a sharp bang on the station's outer plate. No, not a bang. A pop like air pulled through a tight throat. The floodlights guttered. His handheld monitor hiccuped and froze and then rebooted with a cheerful beep that felt inappropriate. Silence fell like a glove over the station. Not quiet, silence. The fans spun and he could see their blades through the grill. The lights glowed, his monitor blinked. But all of it, every hum and hiss and mechanical whisper, lost its sound. He heard his own breath. He did not hear the fans anymore. He did not hear the slow crackle of ice thawing. He did not hear the world. Elias stood very still. "Null field," he said, and the words came out as nothing in the air. He felt his throat move. He felt the way sound should have left him. It did not. The air swallowed it whole. The war of silent stars had taught humanity many things. One of them was this: the enemy, no one was sure if it was a machine civilization gone pure or something worse, could broadcast a field that annihilated vibration. No sound, no radio, no radar, no LiDAR, no sonic imaging, no voice, no music, a field that made ships blind and deaf if they relied on anything that moved air or light. The Vian had called it the quiet. Humans called it the null. The doors shuddered. Elias felt it in his feet. He drew his coil gun in a motion he'd sworn he wouldn't have to practice anymore. He clicked the safety off with his thumb. The click had no sound. He moved to the panel and pulled the bolts free on manual, each one stiff, each one biting his palm. He used the pressure camera, an old analog thing with a tiny needle that danced when something pushed on the outer doors. The needle screamed to the side so fast it left a scratch. Visitors. He walked to the inner bay where the 4 dragons lay in a bath of halogen light that now felt like a candle in a hurricane. Their eyes were open. Their breathing was steady now. The eggs beat like little drumheads under their skins. The dragon's pupils flicked, left, right, left, in an old animal pattern that knew how to measure threat. Elias lifted his free hand and with deliberate slowness touched his heart and then pointed to the floor. Stay. He wasn't sure why he did it like that. He just knew that gestures sometimes found a bridge when words could not. The nearest dragon made a small motion with its claw. It touched its own chest and then the floor. Stay. He pulled a manual override at the service corridor and went up the ladder to the observation slit. Through the slit, he saw the valley in a sheet of silver, dust blowing in a lazy, ground-hugging river. And he saw figures in that dust, moving with that hideous care of precision machines. They looked like statues chiseled from night. Tall, too tall. Shoulders too narrow, heads too smooth. Arms like spears. They carried nothing, and that was worse because when the null was on, weapons were always the size of decisions, not objects. The machines crossed the valley in a line from 3 directions. They made no sound. The snow under their feet did not crunch. Their shadows did not shiver. Elias felt the old cold backwash of fear climb his spine, and he let it because refusing it made it worse. Then he found the ridge of anger under the fear, the stubborn piece of him that had given up everything but never learned surrender. He descended the ladder. He went to the generator room and checked his traps. He'd been a soldier when sound died between ships. He'd watched entire fleets become coffins because they couldn't hear their own hulls. He'd learned to fight in the null. He'd learned to make war with what the field couldn't steal. Mass, heat, light, motion, not measured, not reported, not cheap. The generators here were old Borealis models that had outlived their warranties and expectations. He had rewired them over the years to run reliably. He'd also shaped some of their output into things their designers would have found horrifying. There were steel plates bolted behind vulnerable corners. There were barrels full of bearings positioned where a lever could spill them and turn a hallway into a river of marbles. There were hooks and lines that could be pulled with one hand and dropped with a palm. He had welded into those lines the handles from a life raft he did not have anymore. He had laid a map of the station over the map of his grief and let one teach him the other. And in the dock, under the lights, were 4 beings who had curled around their young in the path of extinction and dragged themselves out of the sky to ask a human for shelter. He didn't plan to fail them. The outer doors didn't blast inward. They flowed like oil in reverse, like a shadow going forward. The null made the metal vibrate so slowly the eye could see it. The bay darkened. The lights flickered, not off, flickered between colors that shouldn't be. Elias ducked behind the loader and watched the first machine enter. It was taller up close. Its chest was smooth. Its joints were not joints. It held a hand up and rotated it in a way no elbow should. Its head turned to take in the room. It had no eyes. It did not need them. Elias had loaded the coil gun with armor peelers that were supposed to be good against plating. He took 2 breaths and fired. The coil gun jumped in his hands and sang no song at all, but the slug hit. He saw the dent. The machine staggered a half step and then stood still again, and the dent smoothed as if someone had heated it from within. He cursed in silence. It was like fighting a shadow with a pebble. He fired twice more. The machine learned. It leaned. The slug struck the wall behind it and sank with a metal sigh that felt obscene because it had no sound. He slipped left across the loader's belly. He pulled a lever as he went. Bearings poured out of a barrel above the bay entrance and rolled in a shimmer of steel across the floor. The machine's foot went down. It slid. Its knee, did it have a knee? Twisted. It fell and did not hit the floor with a crash because there was no crash to be had. It simply met the floor, and the floor moved to accommodate it like the world knew better than to break a thing the null wanted whole. But the fall was still physics. The thing had weight. It had momentum. Elias dove and let gravity do some work they could agree on. He slammed a grapple line around the machine's head and threw it over the loading crane's arm. He ran. He dragged that head with line and pulley and his own angry shoulders. The crane's motor whined in visuals only. The line lifted. The machine rose at an angle it did not like, and its hand reached up faster than his eyes could process. It cut the line by simply deciding the space between its fingers, and the rope didn't need to contain a rope anymore. Elias hit the deck. He rolled. He grabbed the manual crane brake and pulled it so hard his shoulder wrenched and something flashed white in his head. The brake caught. The machine hung crooked, one leg sliding on the bearings like a person trying not to fall in front of their pride. The second machine entered, then a third. They moved like liquid night. Elias crawled backward and came up by the switchboard. He slapped the cover off with one hand and pushed 3 toggles up with the heel of his palm. The halogen lights went blinding white. Then they surged into ultraviolet. The machines paused. They didn't like that. He'd guessed they might not. The null ate motion transmission. It killed signals that relied on waveform, but it couldn't turn off photons without turning off the universe. The field could damp them, scatter them, ruin harmony, but raw UV was raw UV. He poured it on. The machines moved again, this time not casual but cautious. Their surfaces rippled. Elias watched as one of them stepped into the light strike and its chest went stippled as if the UV was cooking something on its skin. He'd be happy if it was cooking them alive. He didn't count on it. He moved to the dragons. Their eyes tracked him. Their breath had gone slow and strong. He touched the egg nearest to his knee. The tap from the inside met his knuckle. "Give me a minute." He whispered into a world that would not carry his whisper. He slid under the loader frame and popped a hatch on the floor. The access drop opened onto the station's main heat channels. The old ducts that had moved furnace air across working bays in the time when humans had sweated and joked and lost bets down here. He shoved a breaker bar into the nearest fan and jammed it until it couldn't turn even if the null decided physics was optional. He pulled a little oxygen canister from his belt and bled it into the duct. He went back to the panel. He flipped the emergency backflow. Heat built like pressure. He saw it in the shimmer of the air above the ducts. He felt it in his teeth. He lifted a pry bar and slammed it into the duct cover. The cover erupted. A blast of heat 9 years in the making punched across the bay. It wasn't flame. It was the thing just before flame, the thing that turns air to twist glass and sweat to steam. The machines had no choice but to respect that. They stepped back, not fast but decisive. Elias smiled for the first time since the sky had gone mute. He held that smile for 3 heartbeats. Then he saw the 4th machine move past the heat and the UV, slow and certain, right toward the dragons. He ran. The machine wasn't dumb. It knew the eggs were the point. It reached with a hand like a guillotine face down. The nearest dragon, his dragon, because he decided that in the shallow part of his mind that branded a thing by how close it was when he hurt, moved its wing. The ice that held the wing shattered like glass under a boot. The wing reached out and met the machine's hand. It looked small in that instant. It looked old and thin, and not the thing from the briefings that his commanders had called Target Delta, Seraph Class, Extreme Caution. It looked like a parent stopping a door with their palm while carrying a sleeping child. The machine's hand ground forward. The dragon's wing burned where it touched the thing. Elias came up on the machine's blind side. He jammed the pry bar into the seam he'd seen on its hip, and he threw his entire body at the lever. He felt his muscles betray their age in a flare of pain and stubbornness. The seam opened, not far, just enough. He pulled a little glass grenade from his vest. He bit the top off like an old movie because his glove wouldn't work on the latch. The chem stink hit his tongue. He rammed the grenade into the seam. The grenade didn't detonate. It reacted. It poured heat into one small place like a judgment. The machine's hip collapsed. It turned its head to look at him with the part of its face that wasn't a face. He didn't care. He slammed the pry bar home again and drove it in until the handle hit metal. He used the machine's leg as leverage to pull himself around its body. He could feel, through his gloves, how little his weight mattered, but it mattered here. The machine fell. It fell onto the bearings. It slid into the pool of backflowing heat. Its surface went black like sugar burned without forgiveness. The other machines moved. Elias threw a hand up and flashed 5 fingers. The nearest dragon's pupil shot to him. He closed his fist. He threw it open again. He pointed to the ceiling, to the UV. The dragon's throat dilated. He saw it, a small opening where he'd been trimming frost earlier, a place where skin was thinner and some organ with a shine to it lurked beneath. It opened its mouth. Light fell out. Not flame. No. Not anything that would heat a kettle. This was a spill of brilliance that hit the nearest machine and did not blind so much as erase. The machine's forearm turned to patterned ash in the wake of that light. Elias saw in the heart of the beam a grain, a rhythm. He felt it in his teeth again like the heat, but this wasn't heat. This was harmony. The null hated harmony. The dragons had found a way to sing without sound. Elias laughed. It came out as air and pride in a world that refused applause. The 3 remaining machines tried a new angle. They flowed outward toward the walls and began to curve around the UV beams, which Elias redirected with a frantic 2-handed dance on the switchboard toggles. He could see their plan. They would force him to choose an angle to defend, then exploit the gap to put a hand on an egg and do whatever a hand like that does to small lives. He needed a wall they couldn't go around. He needed a human trick. The station had a crane arm mounted on rails across the ceiling. It could move fast if its old hydraulics were bribed with enough energy. Elias yanked the override on the coolant pump and sent a pulse of raw power into the crane motor. The rail shrieked in silence as the crane tore across it. A chain hung from the crane's hook. He'd used it to drag ship parts and dreams. He had replaced sections over the years with chain made from a weird alloy he'd gotten from a junker who'd wanted to buy his coffee pot and couldn't. The chain had a gleam to it that reminded him of stars. He swung that chain out with a hand-thrower's accuracy he didn't have when people were looking. The chain caught the arm of the machine on the left. He slapped the brake. The chain went taut. The machine's arm stopped. The rest of it tried to keep going. It learned about inertia. It learned about human-made steel that didn't care if you were a god in a black suit. It learned about angle of pull. The machine began to spin slowly, with the grace of a planet about to throw itself into a star. Elias grunted and threw a breaker. The overhead sprinkler system leapt alive. It soaked heat-shimmering air with droplets that turned into tiny crystals as they crossed the null. The water hit the UV-lit field and ripped into steam that didn't sing. The machine's surfaces went matte under it. The dragons lit the bay. The nearest two opened their throats and spilled that knot flame onto the oncoming figures, and the knot flame gnawed at the null itself. The field bent. Elias had never seen anything like that. A tear opened in the silence. He heard for a second only a note, not a sound, a note, like a bell a mile away. Then the null crushed it. He whispered, "Keep going," at the dragons and moved through the wreckage to the nearer machine that had fallen. He found the seam in its side and used his blade from the field kit to cut something that looked like a cable and smelled like a foundation beneath a city. The machine twitched, as if disagreeing with his decision to alter its day. It tried to stand. The dragon's beam hit it like noon. It stilled. Elias staggered to the other. He did the same. The last machine moved with that ugly surety again. It reached. It adjusted. It ignored light. It ignored the dragon's beam entirely, at least at this range. It had learned to tilt its surface so the beam struck at an angle that did less. It reached for the smallest egg. Elias was too far. His legs knew it. His heart refused. He moved anyway, and then the fourth dragon opened its eyes for the first time. They were paler than the others. They had bands of white in them that looked like wind across sand. It had not moved before now. It had looked dead. It lifted its head one handspan. Its jaw unlatched with a click like a stone pressed into slush. It did not spill light like the others. It exhaled. Frost. The breath moved through the null like a thought and became structures where it passed, little lattices, crystalline gardens, a slow-blooming flower of ice with geometry that made the brain stutter to admire. The breath touched the machine's hand, and the machine's hand stalled as if someone had replaced its joints with memory. The hand kept going. The dragon kept breathing. The frost formed a bridge between the dragon's mouth and the egg. It formed in layers. Elias saw, with eyes that had measured death and the time between pulses in flares and travel and soldiering, that each layer was a word in a language the dragons carved into crystal and taught their children before the children were born. The frost touched the egg. The egg answered. The machine's hand stopped. Elias hit the machine at the waist, because he could, because it was there. He didn't do much. He didn't have to. The frost did. It climbed the machine's arm like ivy. It turned black polished smoothness into winter lace. Elias watched the thing's surface move desperately, trying to shed the frost, and he realized with a clarity that felt like a sunrise what he was seeing. The dragons weren't breathing cold. They were breathing pattern. They were writing a word of refusal across the machine. The word was home. The machine lifted its other hand. Elias saw the null sheen in its palm, the way light folded there like a moth caught too close to a candle. He had one move left that he could make with dignity. He stepped between the egg and the machine's hand. There wasn't time to think about it. There wasn't time to be noble. There was just a body and a line and the knowledge that sometimes lines are human-shaped. He braced. The hand came down. It did not hit him. It did not move through him. It stopped in air one finger's breadth above his chest. It quivered there like a held breath. Then it began to shake. The surface of the black machine's palm rippled, and a ripple like water met the frost, and they argued. The frost won. Elias watched a star, no, a light like a star, kindle slowly in the black. It was the UV reflected weird. It was the not flame. It was the pattern writing its refusal deeper. He didn't have a poetic answer. He had sweat running into his eyes and the pain in his shoulder like fire, and his teeth clenched so hard he thought they might break. He did the one thing the null could not prevent him from doing. He put his hand up and pressed it flat against the machine's palm. He was a human whose species had been told die quietly, and it never had. He pushed. The human hand and the machine hand met. He was not strong enough to move it. He did not need to be. The touch completed something the dragon's frost had begun. The patterns climbed his hand and his arm, and he felt the cold hit his bones and not hurt him. He felt his own heart knock against his ribs and make a rhythm the frost liked. The machine shuddered. He and the frost and the dragons wrote a new word across it. The word was no. The machine melted, not like sugar, not like metal under a torch. The machine came apart as if it had remembered too many different shapes of itself at once, and decided that being one of them was not worth the effort. It was over in seconds that felt like a hymn. Elias fell back onto a crate and discovered that his legs were cousins with rubber. He laughed again, and this time the laugh had a sound. Not strong, not full, but a breath and a ghost, because the null had cracked somewhere in the fight and the dragon's singing light had made room for sound to be born again, even small. He heard the faint whir of the fans. He heard the sting of water on hot metal. He heard very clearly the tap from inside the nearest egg. He cried. It was a ridiculous time to cry. He did it anyway. He still hadn't figured out what had knocked the sky mute in the first place, what had driven the Vian this far rimward, across dead moons to a closed station with a man in it who had sworn he didn't belong anywhere but the quiet. He would. He had help now. The dragons lifted their heads. They watched him with interest, and also with something like respect that made him look away because he felt unworthy. He was an old soldier who had lost too many commas between too many words. He had no medals left and no faith in anything that required confession. The nearest dragon moved its head closer and pressed its forehead to his chest. The direction of words moved through him again. It felt stronger now, as if the null could not steal that either once the dragons had written a pattern against it. Shelter, thank you, sorrow, danger not gone, brewed soon, and a new direction he had not felt before. Name. He touched his chest and then his mouth, and he said the syllables that had been his anchor when the war noise had been taken away. Elias. The dragon's chest rose and fell. The sound that came from its throat was not human. It was a piece of stone rolled down a mountain in spring and polished to kindness when it reached the valley. It tried. Elias. He laughed again and put his hand on its muzzle, close enough. The dragons shifted, their wings flexed, the ice that had held them broke. The nearest egg, the one that had tapped the longest, cracked with a sound like sugar under a spoon. A small, long face pressed against the inside. The shell broke in a neat circle as if cut with a jeweler's saw. A tiny dragon nose sniffed the world. Elias felt something in his chest that had been sleeping for years sit up and ask for coffee. He looked past the bay to the observation slit to the valley. The machines lay like spilled shadow and frost in the ground, but further off he could see a new line in the snow, not moving yet. He rubbed his eyes. They were moving. They were very far away. He had minutes. He needed to know something before the next wave came. He needed to understand the enemy and the thing these Vian carried that made the necropolis of the war cry like a child left alone. He looked at the fourth dragon, the one that had breathed pattern and saved them. Its eyes were not like the others. They were full of weather. He crouched by its head and pressed his palm to the place the thin skin showed the organ beneath. The direction of words unfurled. Worlds. Stars. Suns ringed by black. Things that looked like petals closing, except the petals were made of machines and would never, ever open again. Humans had seen Dyson shells in diagrams and said someday. Someone else had said today, and those shells had snapped around the brightest stars in the local arm, not to harvest energy, to choke it, to stop light, to make the war's anthem. The dragons had fought there where light had been turned into a rumor. They had been sung in the bones by a generation of elders whose voices did not need air. They could not sing their young into being where there was no rhythm. The eggs had cooled. The little hearts stuttered. The dragons had fled ahead of the shells. They had carried their children the only way they could, folded into pattern, encoded in ice, breathed across vacuum and fused to their chests so that their own body heat would keep the equation intact. They had come rimward because the machines didn't respect rimward worlds. The machines had followed because the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was a small life that wanted to live. Elias closed his eyes. He saw, in that language, the way the dragons carved history into ice and taught it to their babies before they hatched. He saw a memory of a human in a Vian hall once, long ago before the War of Silent Stars had a name, a human singing a lullaby to a brood while the dragons listened in stillness, deeply moved by a species that would sing to a thing that could not yet answer. He opened his eyes and looked at the little dragon peering out of its egg. He whispered, because even if the null hated sound, some things deserved to be said, "Hey there, kiddo." The wave in the snow drew closer. Elias stood and moved like a man who had remembered an old set of steps. He refilled the chem grenades. He unslung the coil gun and replaced the peeling slugs with shock needles that relied less on impact and more on kinetic confusion. He tightened the chain on the crane and cleaned the frost off the UV housings. He wished he had a friend to crack a joke to. He didn't. He had the dragons. He looked at them and lifted his hand again, palm out. "Fight with me." The nearest dragon bowed its head. The others did the same. The second egg cracked. Then the third. The little shapes inside blinked at the light and at him and at the broken machines and at their elders. Elias had held little things at critical moments before. None of them had been this sharp in his memory. The wave crossed the ridge. They were not the tall machines this time. They were smaller. Many. A cloud of black birds that weren't birds. They moved in a swarm that made geometric sense if you gave up a piece of your soul to understand it. They carried null pearl at their centers. They could cut a ship in half in total silence and write a report about their efficiency in a language with no verbs. Elias didn't let them in. He opened the outer bay doors himself. Wind slammed into the station like a long friend. The swarm poured forward like smoke with intent. Elias fed the sprinklers again and doused the approach with water that turned to ice in midair. He shoved pallets of crate into place and created a snow fort his childhood would have admired if his childhood had been allowed to keep its forts. He waited until the first of the swarm hit the UV field. Then, he stepped into the doorway with the coil gun and fired shock needles into the heart of the cloud. The needles carried a tiny battery that did one thing well. It forgot to be silent. The null couldn't kill it because the needle didn't transmit anything. It simply made a small localized confusion in the right frequency bands, like a child hitting a piano with joy. The swarm faltered there for an instant, a heartbeat. The needles chewed little holes in it. The dragons lit the doorway. Light with grain tore across the night, and it didn't so much kill the small machines as erase the code that held their choices together. They fell like burned paper. The frost breath wrote refusal where the light couldn't reach. They fought like that through a long winter minute. The minute became 10. The 10 became an hour. The hour stretched across the moon's cold morning. The null rose and fell in waves, as if the enemy was testing responses. Elias saw the swarm tear itself apart once to avoid a pattern the dragons had written across the air. He saw the tall machines come again with new angles and new arrogance, and he saw them learn to fear human cranes and steel and chain. He bled from his arm where a shard of something cruel had scraped him. He tightened a bandage with his teeth and kept moving. The little dragons were born by then. They crawled across the bay under their parents' wings and looked out at a galaxy that had done them dirty, and decided not to hold it against the first human they met. Elias threw scraps of old cloth near them to make beds. They bit the cloth with tiny teeth and shredded it into nests. He had never been honored like that. In the lull between waves, he sat on a crate, breathing like he'd paid a debt to do it, and looked down at his hands. They shook. He refused to tell them to stop. He looked at the dragons. He wondered what he was supposed to do next. The fourth dragon, Weather Eyes, exhaled a ribbon of frost into the air and carved, with astonishing care, the shape of a door. Then it pressed its forehead to the door and sent a feeling through him. Leave, not flee, not abandon, not go, human, we got this. Leave with a sense of boundary and safety. He frowned. He looked up at the ceiling. He understood slowly, as the station showed him its guts in a new way only people who have nearly died with a place earn. The station's heat channels and ducts connected to old blast tunnels dug when Borealis had imagined trouble might come with dynamite and not with silence. Those tunnels led to the buried reactor farm in the foothills, the one that had been offline since the last ice storm had poured glass into its throat. If he could go there, if he could turn a reactor on, if he could vent that reactor into the valley. Light, heat, pressure, not words, not signals, not anything the null respected enough to steal. He looked at the dragons, he pointed to himself, then to the ceiling, then to the valley. The dragons nodded. The fourth leaned in. It touched its forehead to his chest again. The emotion was simple and a little like an order and a lot like trust. Go. He went. He ran the maintenance ladder and slid down the ballast tanks and crawled through a duct that had been shaped when the moon had different weather. He felt the null move and his head ring with it. He breathed through it. He hit the old blast tunnel with his boots and blinked into dark that his lantern cut into shapes that looked like home if home had been made by people who forgot how to smile but remembered how to bolt a door. He found the reactor farm by memory he'd written from maps that had never expected to matter. He found the main house. He pushed the door. The door refused. He put his shoulder to it. Old wood remembered him and relented without apology. He stepped into a room that smelled like a storm had been trapped in it and had grown bitter at the company. He found the console. He turned on the lamp above it by flipping a switch that was older than he was. He laid his palm on the glass that covered the emergency startup sequence and let the station ask him one more time if he was sure. He was sure. He pulled the cover off a panel that had always made him laugh. It had a faded sticker of a cat clinging to a tree branch with the words "hang in there," and he flipped the heavy three-phase that told the reactor that its long nap was over. The reactor woke like a sleeping dog with arthritic hips, slow, careful, irritated, but interested in dinner. Elias coaxed it. He bled heat into the coolant. He hummed out of stubbornness, a song he'd learned before the war, a silly bar thing about a girl from Ganymede who laughed like a bell. The reactor didn't need the song. He did. He watched the gauges rise. He watched the fail-safes argue and then agree. He opened the vent to the valley. The sound in the room changed in a way that made his skin want to turn inside out and giggle. He didn't laugh. He set dials. He calculated in his head, because he didn't trust the old analogs, how much he could pour out there without turning the valley into a glass bowl forever. He found the number. He found the courage to turn the wheel. The vent opened. A pillar of white roared up from the foothills like someone had dragged a new sun halfway out of the earth, and then remembered they had somewhere to be. The null hit it like a wall and scattered in sheets. The UV light from the station carved lines in it like relief. The dragon's knot flame poured into the vents like a choir. The valley learned, for a moment that could have been 1,000 years, how to be loud again. Elias felt the pressure of it push his back into the console. He felt the dragon language hit the reactor fan and make the fins hum a chord he would dream about later, when it was not the world anymore and just his head trying to make sense of victory. He staggered out into the blast tunnel and looked through the grill toward the bay. He saw the swarm collapse like sugar under rain. He saw the tall machines stumble and then fall to their knees in a way that would have been pious if it hadn't been physics. He whooped. He heard the whoop bounce off walls that had not heard joy in a decade. He heard very faintly the answering roar of dragons. It ended. Not like a door slamming, not like a string cut, but like someone deciding to stop a song on a note that left the ear wanting another. The null thinned. It didn't go away. It never did. It shifted farther off, as if the enemy had decided this valley wasn't worth basic hygiene. Elias slid down the tunnel wall and put his head against his knees. He took a long breath of heat and dust and reactor sweat and his own fears exhale. Then he stood again, because he wasn't done. He closed the vent to a quarter to keep pressure in reserve. He set a timer that would give them another blast if the null came like rain again. He marked his path back with chalk because he'd learned the hard way that heroics fade faster than caution. He returned to the bay. The dragons met him with eyes like condensed weather and mouths that made light and hands that could write in frost. The little ones crawled toward him on elbows that would be wings. One bit his boot. He pretended to be in danger. The little one growled and looked proud. He told himself to remember that sound forever. He went to the observation slit and looked at the valley. The machines lay like broken chess pieces under new drifts. In the far distance, he could see the glimmer that meant the ring around the local star was still out there somewhere, closing petal by petal. He had won a day. He turned back to the bay. He saw the dragons looking at him with that respect again. It made his throat hurt. He opened his mouth to say something that would be inadequate and knew he ought to be careful. Words matter when silence has been your mentor. The fourth dragon moved. It breathed a long, slow frost across the floor. It carved in that frost an image of a human not unlike him and four dragons small and curled and warm around the human's legs. Then it drew a door. The door opened. Beyond the door it sketched stars, many stars, noisy stars. Stars not ringed. Then it drew the ring and it crossed the ring out with a careful claw. The message was not complicated. It hurt to look at because simple things held the heaviest. Come with, fight with, bring your noise. Elias closed his eyes and saw himself 30 years ago, cocky and good at fixing broken valves, before the war had taught him that the quiet parts of a person are the ones you can't hear scream. He saw himself saying no to orders he should have saluted and yes to rescues he should have run from. He saw himself watching a friend die in perfect silence and promising a God he didn't believe in that if he lived he would never turn the volume down on anything that needed to be heard again. He opened his eyes and looked at the little dragons playing with his bootlace. He said, "All right." He raised his coil gun. He laid it on a crate as if he were putting a flag down. He touched his heart with 2 fingers and then pointed to the dragons and then to the door the frost had drawn. They bowed their heads. They unfurled their wings within the constraints of the bay and measured the walls with the dignity of engineers. They were ready to go. He wasn't. Borealis Station wasn't either. It had served him. It had kept him when no one else had wanted to. He walked the length of the bay and touched the corners. He pressed his hand to the support beam where he'd carved his initials in a night when he was more alone than humans are supposed to be. He told the wall thank you. He told the heaters thank you. He told the tug-together sleds and the chain and the sprinklers and the UV housings and the trap barrels and the hatch in the floor thank you. The dragons watched with a patient respect that made him want to sit down and talk for years. He didn't have years here. He moved to the dock controls and whispered, this time to himself, because sound had returned and he didn't know what to do with it. "Let's make you proud." He opened the doors. The sky was no longer thief dark. The aurora had come back like a woman who knew you'd been waiting and decided to forgive you. The wind sang. The snow skated across the yard. The valley lay like a blank page with indentations where a story had been written in a language about endurance. The dragons moved out one by one, slow for the little ones, careful for the eggs now hatched. Elias walked beside them with the coil gun slung and his shoulders set. He looked back once. The lights of Borealis Station glowed warm against the cold. He felt what you feel when you leave a place that saved your life. He walked on. They took the path he'd marked with chalk through the blast tunnel and out across the foothill to the reactor farm. They did not fly yet. The little ones couldn't, and the elders would not insult them by rising where the children had to crawl. Elias loved them for that. They reached the vent. Elias explained with gestures and that new bridge of feeling where the wheel was and how to open it, and the dragons touched the wheel with claws that could cut machines and kindness in the same stroke. They breathed into the vent in light and frost and turned a human reactor into a cathedral pipe. The vent sang. It sang not like a pipe organ but like a machine that had touched hands and decided hands were holy. Elias saw, across the valley now, the black ring shimmer like a mirage. He saw the petal nearest them pause as if reconsidering. He saw in that pause an invitation to ruin itself if it wanted to. The dragons lifted their wings. They rose. Elias did not ask how they carried him. He felt claws gentle as mercy hook into his coat and belt. He felt the rush of air and reactor heat. He saw the valley drop away. He saw the station's roof. He saw where his footsteps had written anger and work and hope into the snow. He did not look back again. He looked forward. They climbed above the ridge. Borealis 9 spread out beneath like a bruise with lights under it. The ring glowed ahead like an eclipse that had lost its manners. Elias felt, pressed between dragon's spine and night air, that old fear. He met it with the shape of new courage. He thought of a line he'd once heard a pilot say in a bar that had burned down with a grin that had been too big for the room. "Let's go wake up some sleeping stars." They did. The dragons took him into the high cold the null loved. The null pressed in. The dragons pushed back. Elias held the reactor pulse steady with a little control pad that had no right to talk to a machine this old. He sweated under cold and laughed through pain. He watched that petal of the ring send a ripple toward them. He watched it unmake light where it touched space. The fourth dragon breathed frost. Words hung in the air between ring and wing. Home, no, ours, live. The ring hesitated. Elias knew the ring couldn't hesitate. It was machine. It did. Machines can be taught to think but not to believe. The dragons believed. He reached one gloved finger out into the air. He wrote a word in the frost that boiled off his knuckle. Together, the ring learned a new thing. It learned that the language of frost and the grammar of light and the punctuation of reactor heat could put a human word into a place that didn't expect it. It cracked. Not all the way, not yet. The petal above them shivered the way metal does when a stress finds a seam. The dragons poured their knot flame into that seam. Elias opened the vent too far and laughed at the alarms that told him he should not. They tore a hole in the ring. Light came through. It touched the dragons. It touched Elias. It touched the little ones riding between elder wings. He cried and laughed and yelled. The null ripped his voice apart into threads and then decided it didn't have patience for him anymore and let the yell be a yell. The wave of machines below fell apart like guilt when you tell the truth. They flew on because you don't fix the sky by poking one hole in a lid this big. They carved another seam. They wrote another word. The ring shuddered. It began to close the first hole while the second opened, because the enemy was good at being bad and would not give up the game just because someone had taught it a single new rule. They taught it another. They flew to the inner edge. There, where the ring met the star's own ancient light, the null had less arrogance because even silence has to lift its hat when a star insists. The dragons hung in that light and opened their throats. They sang. Elias did not hear the song with his ears. He heard it with his scars. He heard it with the place in him that had refused 100 funerals and then agreed to one, the one where he buried the part of himself that wanted to stop trying. He reached out his hand. He pressed it to the fourth dragon's neck. He added his heartbeat. It was a terrible instrument. It turned out to be the one the song had needed. The ring shook. It tried to be a shell. It became a drum. The dragons played it. Elias gave them a tempo. The reactor threw heat like applause. The star woke up the rest of the way and said, with all the gravity of a thing that knows its own worth no more. The ring split along a lattice. It peeled back in a petal, then another. In the valley, the machines fell like empty jackets. On the horizon, the blur of enemy fell away in a retreat that didn't understand shame because it had never been asked to. The null broke. Sound ran back into the world. Elias heard the wind again. He heard the little dragons cry like gulls cutting air. He heard the laughter of their elders. He heard his own voice saying a string of words that were not in the book of prayers but would have to do. They flew back to Borealis Station with the sun in pursuit like a dog finally allowed off its chain. The station looked small. It looked brave. The bay doors stood open, and a snow eddy had formed inside. Elias landed on the dock and fell to his knees because his legs finally remembered they were tired. The dragons landed all around him and folded their wings and laid their heads down and looked at him like a friend you haven't known long enough but already trust because they bled beside you. He stood. He put his hand on the nearest muzzle again. The language came like a gift. Thank you. Come with, teach, learn, home together, fight not done, hope. He answered with the one thing he had that felt the right size. Yes. Days passed like cups of hot drink handed back and forth between friends. They repaired the bay doors. They built harnesses out of chain and leather from old seat straps. They taught the little ones to hop and not hurt themselves. Elias learned the shapes of Vian beginnings, how a newborn listened to frost and rewrote its own bones from what it heard. He told them stories he had never told anyone, because sometimes telling a story to a thing that doesn't know your language makes the story true in a way it wasn't before. Messages arrived on human spectrum again when the null lifted far enough, thin and ragged. Borealis was not alone. Other stations had lit their reactor vents. Others had sheltered other wanderers. A pattern was forming across the far rim that looked, if you squinted, like a sentence. Elias stood under the aurora one night and watched the lines of different languages write themselves in stars. He thought of the ring and its arrogance. He thought of the dragons and their doors. He thought of the world learning a new grammar it had needed since someone first decided that quiet was a weapon. The next morning he packed. He left a note on the station wall, not because anyone would read it, but because you honor old bones. I was here. We fought. We lived. We made noise. He and the dragons left Borealis 9. They flew into a night that was no longer a lid. They flew to stars that had old promises still owed. They found human ships limping and taught them how to write no in frost across machine faces. They found Vian clans hiding in rock shadows and brought them reactors to sing with. They found other refugees, a species like glass birds from the Carina cusp, a set of patient trees from a comet, a few humans who had worn silence like a coat for too long and were ready to take it off. They fought again and again because the enemy didn't run out of arrogance overnight. They fought with heat and light and pattern and the human muscle that still had a few songs left to play. On a day that was a day because people had decided it was. A day marked on no calendar but remembered by all who lived it. They came into the shadow of a ring bigger than any that had closed around a sun before. It was at the edge of the local arm, the border where old maps had written "Here there be dragons" as a joke without imagining they were right. The ring opened like a mouth. The dragons sang. Elias put his hand on a console in a human ship that smelled like sweat and hope and set the vent. He heard the star climb into the song. He heard, in the corner of the bridge where he had fixed a cracked mug with tape, the echo of laughter he would know anywhere now. He watched the ring crack. He watched light flood a darkness that had believed itself permanent. He whispered to the viewing pane, "I told you I'd help wake sleeping stars." The pane didn't answer. The dragons did. They sent him a feeling that was not a word and not a sentence and not a promise. It was family. When they returned to Borealis after the war had changed shape again and become a thing you could sometimes win in afternoons, they found the station held fast. Snow had dressed it nicely. The bay doors opened like someone making a place at a table. Elias walked into the dock and pressed his hand to the beam again. He carved a new thing with his knife. We were here. We fought. We lived. We made noise. He taught the little dragons to carve their own marks beneath, careful not to cut too deep and hurt the wood. Their claws made perfect lines. They learned quickly. They laughed like gulls. He slept that night without dreaming about silence. In the morning he stood outside with a mug steaming in his hands and watched a sun that had almost been stolen burn like a coin no one could afford to pocket. The dragons dozed in a knot that looked like warmth and luck. He thought of all the work ahead, the rings still to crack, the ships to save, the new babies to teach to listen to frost. He smiled at the long road that didn't care if a man was tired as long as he was going. He turned to the station for a last look at its comfortable ugliness. He saw a mark on the doorframe that hadn't been there the night before. He stepped close and squinted. It was a human letter. H. He grinned until it hurt. He walked to the dragons. He touched the fourth, the weather-eyed one, on the neck. It opened an eye. The feeling came. Ready? He nodded. They took to the sky. The war that had been silent discovered a new truth on that day and all the days after. It discovered that quiet is brittle. It discovered that humans make noise on purpose. It discovered that dragons write in frost and light and love. It discovered that families can be decided by rescue. They flew into that discovery like a flag. Elias carried a small kit on his belt now, an odd little set of tools he'd made. It held an amp meter that didn't know fear, a piece of chain that had learned to hold gods, and a scrimshaw of frost he'd saved from the first refusal they'd written together. He used them when things got hard. He liked the way they felt in his hand. They felt like the world when it remembers itself. He would always remember that first knock on the door of the station, the way the bay had gone silent, the way a hand had come down and been stopped by frost and a human palm. He would always remember the look of a baby dragon seeing a reactor vent sing and understanding. He would always be a soldier, perhaps. He would always be a rescuer now, certainly. He would always be noise. The story of that era traveled, as stories do, across languages and starlight and the gaps between hearts. People told it in bars on stations where music had found its way back. Dragons carved it into ice in halls where newborns slept. Machines, repaired by hands they tried to kill, learned to hum along. They called it the War of Silent Stars. They said it was when quiet learned manners. They said it was when a man on a dead moon opened his doors to dragons and found his family. They said the ring-breaking cry that had rolled across the local arm had sounded like a name. Elias stood in a cockpit one day with little dragons asleep under the dash and older ones riding the wake, and looked out at a sky that had relearned how to be loud. He pressed a hand to the glass as if touching an old friend. He spoke, and the words went out this time and hit ears that needed them. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken. END the story.